We did the other day a debate on campus with a Tory, a UKIP, a Labour, an artist from Italy, and me. I was quite something about.
Was it lively?
It was, yeah, very
I should
lively.
probably start actually. It's great to have so many interesting, different people assembled for this next subject about arts in Birmingham, and this is vision. How does Birmingham see itself going forward? What's our vision as a city and our vision for the arts? I just want to start by firstly asking you to each introduce yourself briefly with a short biog and a description of what your involvement in the arts is. I'll go clockwise.
Okay, me first. Robert Neal, President of the Royal Birmingham Society of Artists. I'm an artist member, a businessman, and the RBSA, if people know anything about it, we're an artist-led charity. One of the oldest cultural institutions in Birmingham, celebrated our bicentenary in 2014. And as an artist, I've exhibited widely, including the BP Portrait Award at the National Portrait Gallery, and locally at Birmingham Museum as well.
Thank you.
I'm Nick Reed. I'm Chief Executive of Performances Birmingham, which is the charity that runs Town Hall and Symphony Hall. I've just joined the organisation, started in January, but grew up in Birmingham, so all my first cultural experiences were here in this city. My career has been purely in managing arts venues. From when I realised that 3 chords wasn't going to make a musical career, I decided that it was going to be on venue management that was the only chance of earning a crust. And I've been lucky enough to work in venues around the UK, in Ireland, brief stint in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and now back to Birmingham, which is a great place to be.
I could show you that 4th chord if you want later.
Just take one finger off and I'll take a minor. I'll be fine. Yeah.
Thanks. Miguel.
I'm Miguel Oyarzun. I'm one of the co-directors of B Festival with Isla Aguilar, which stands for Birmingham European Festival. And the ethos of the festival is to bring the best emerging work from across Europe to Birmingham and showcase Birmingham as a great city for the arts. I share my career as a director of the festival and as an actor in Spain, where I live part of the year and have my own theatre company.
Thank you.
Symon Easton, currently Head of Cultural Development for the City Council. My background is in theatre and production management, and then a bit like Nick, managing theatres, touring around this country and abroad, before going into venue management. The last sort of 10 or 12 years have been with local authorities as sort of arts and production manager, and as I say now, the last 6 years Head of Cultural Development in Birmingham.
Great. And last but not least.
Hi, I'm Satnam Rana. I'm the Arts and Culture Correspondent for BBC Midlands Today. I've been in this position for 5 years now, and it's very much about reflecting what our city and the wider region is doing on the arts and cultural platform, from grassroots right through to the huge institutions we have on our doorstep.
Thanks. So all quite important roles really in separate ways in terms of shaping and expressing arts provision in the city. How do you think Birmingham's arts landscape is faring in comparison to the rest of the UK? Discuss. How does our artistic landscape compare with the rest of the country? I don't know if anyone wants to chime in first, but
Well, I was thinking about it, and what struck me, because my partner also works in the cultural sector as well, with connections to sort of particularly museums around the country, and actually when you think about so many other cities that are losing all of their arts funding and have got museums closing and various cultural institutions just not able to continue at all, I kind of think Birmingham's doing not bad, you know. Clearly there are challenges, and everybody, I'm sure, will talk about money later in the conversation, but I don't think we're doing too badly, really.
Anyone offer a countervailing opinion? I agree with you largely.
I think what we sometimes forget about is the great institutions that we do have within our city. You know, we should stand up and be very proud of the fact that we've got world-renowned organisations like the CBSO, the Symphony Hall here as a venue. So from venues to actual artists that are within the city, embedded in the city, that Birmingham Royal Ballet taking the name of the city across the world. And from that point of view, I always feel as if we are faring well. At the same time, there are huge challenges because we are in an economy where there have been budget constraints over the last 5 to 10 years, and reflecting on that.
Sure.
I feel that in the reporting that I've done, certainly we're pretty savvy as a city, actually, which is why we have survived and those institutions have moved forward, as well as some of the grassroots organisations, which I'll come to a little later on.
I think something that's come up from other discussions as well is sometimes the disconnect between organisations that have adapted and rethought, and then more peripheral arts provision, cold spots across the city, people that aren't connected to that arts provision.
Yeah, there's one thing having the organisations, there's another thing with perhaps public perception and participation. And I think in relation to that, I feel that perhaps we don't fare as well as other cities. We can compare ourselves to London, but London in itself is an individual beast. You've got huge tourism industry there, etc. We quite often compare ourselves to the Manchesters and the Liverpools. There is work to be done when it comes to participation and reflecting.
And I'd say sometimes those, agreeing with you, those comparisons sometimes reflect favourably or unfavourably. We do some outreach. There is some engagement in cities and places around the country where there's not. But I'd single out a venue like the Albany in Deptford in London that I've worked in, and a few others in London I think kind of lead the way, where the community really do feel like part of the venue, that they really feel like they've embraced all aspects of their locum. It's not, let's just create something to provide for people who are interested in the arts, but everybody living in that locality, and we haven't always been the best at executing that.
But I think it's true to say, I don't want to hog this subject,
Sure.
but that we're also, although I said we're doing well, I think comparatively, which was the question, but I think we're all hanging on with our fingertips as well at the same time. You know, so I think it's, in the context, we're not doing too badly, but it's very, very tough to make ends meet. And I think when you're also being ambitious about what you want to try and do, when you've got your capacity of your organisation, which is, you know, really, really shrunk from what it might have been at one time, and I know that many of the larger organisations would have struggled with that. You know, at RBSA, we've always been a fairly small charity, so, you know, our capacity's always been small. So, but I can imagine it'd be more challenging for some of those organisations that have had to shrink substantially. I mean, Birmingham City Council being one, I'm sure.
Yeah, in answer to your question, I mean, how is it comparing to the rest of the country? It's always difficult to benchmark, isn't it? You know, who are you benchmarking? You mentioned Manchester, Liverpool, but even then, you know, there are different organisations, there are different communities, so it's very difficult. But in the context of how it's doing generally, in light of the current economic climate, which is really difficult, you know, public sector funding is doing nothing but going down. Birmingham is doing really well. That you know, organisations are still managing to sustain themselves. But I agree, Richard, it's very, very difficult, and it's going to get harder. And there's a whole discussion to be had about the cultural pound and how the organisations are addressing that. The second point you made, Soweto, is about you know, are we reaching across the whole city? And I think that's constantly a challenge. It's by no accident that the major arts organisations are all very centralised. You know, it's very centric, and that does create a problem when you've got 10 districts in Birmingham, each with an average of 100,000 people, which is the size of a small town anywhere else that has its own arts centre and possibly a theatre as well. There is a real challenge for all of us, not just the arts organisations, to get out in the communities and reach people that are otherwise not being reached.
Absolutely.
Miguel, speak, yeah.
Yes, I was going to say that it's a very tricky question, and I think it is because Birmingham suffers from a syndrome of second city. Here, being an outsider, I was struck by the fact that everybody tends to say, oh, we're the second, we're bigger than Birmingham, than Manchester, we're not London because we're too close. And I think that question itself is not very positive for the city, because I think we should compare what Birmingham was 10 years ago and how, whether it has grown or it has shrunk. Yeah. And from my perspective, being here for 10 years, I think it's done massive. Yeah. And it's incredible to see how many organizations have thrived, to see audiences coming in, not only from the city, and of course there are challenges to to be faced as how to reach audiences that don't tend to go to the art. But I think that is a general problem across the country and across Europe, really. How do we reach?
I'm just curious, what made you come to Birmingham as opposed to, was it a case of going Manchester, Bristol?
No,
Birmingham?
it was, well, I would say coincidental, but if we had chosen a city, this was the city that would need this, because when we came just out of coincidence to a conference where the Arts Council was looking at what was the scene in theatre in the Midlands, and everybody in the room was talking about the need of more international work. And at the time we were touring with our company, and we were very surprised by the fact that there wasn't an international theatre festival in the city, which is very common in other cities around the globe, really. So we thought, you know, big population in Birmingham, they don't have an international theatre festival.
Population in Birmingham too.
Absolutely. And so you should have this, and people thought it was a great idea, and they said, why don't you do it? And then we started doing it.
And you've done a great job.
And it's worked very well.
Yeah.
Flagship.
Just to bring the I kind of declare my Manchester baggage at this point. So I've worked in Manchester for the last 10 years, so I think we need to all put kind of Manchester outside the door. Birmingham, coming with fresh eyes back to Birmingham, what you see is a rich and vibrant cultural infrastructure here in terms of the organisations, the art that's being made in this city, and I think it's every bit as good as everything that's happening everywhere else. I think answering the question of how we're faring nationally, there's a collective question, which is how is everywhere out of London faring against London in terms of that cultural rebalancing that needs to happen in terms of how funds are distributed nationally in the country. And you're probably aware of the study that was done a couple of years ago, which identified that sort of something north of 60 quid per head of population of art goes into arts funding in London, whereas in the rest of the country it's more like 4 or 5 quid. You know, and yes, you have national companies that sit in London and work nationally, but the reality is there's still a huge amount of rebalancing that needs to happen. So I think against that landscape and looking at the vibrancy of notwithstanding that, what we're able to deliver in this city. I'm walk around last week with the last couple of weeks with the International Dance Festival on, stuff happening all over the city. I think if you look and say yes, we're in a confident place.
And I'll just add to that statistic about, they say upwards of 90% of corporate sponsorship is in London. Mm-hmm. So that means the rest of the country, Manchester, Birmingham included, Liverpool, have got 10% of the other corporate. Now that's not the fault of corporate businesses, but the rebalancing, I think, is particularly with the public sector funding, lottery funding as well, around the rest of a fair distribution is key to the future success, not just for Birmingham, but for the rest of the country.
This ties into the next question in some way, in terms of rebalancing. And I guess the philosophy that we have as a city. Liverpool considers culture to be, quote unquote, rocket fuel for the city's regeneration. Further, George Osborne acknowledges a considerable return on investment in the arts sector nationally, noting that 1 billion of funding adds £250 billion to the economy. That sounds like a classic George Osborne. Yeah. Something for something. Given these statements, are continued cuts to arts funding by Birmingham City Council short-sighted? Given these statements.
Shall I take that one?
I just thought I'd actually...
Well, it's enforced, and this is it. And it's ironic that George Osborne made that statement because, beg your pardon, I've hit my microphone. The cuts to local government are enforced, and it's always difficult when arts funding, from local authority perspective, is non-statutory. There are so many other pressures on local authorities, adult social care, children's services, particularly in Birmingham, as we all know, that are under pressure already. That the case for culture is a very hard, difficult one to make, and the return on investment is something like every pound invested by the city council is returned £8 from other earned income. So those figures do speak for themselves, but. The challenge is, and whether we like it or not, the arts funding from local authorities, and as has been mentioned before by Richard, that many other local authorities have already completely removed their arts service, and arts funding is going completely. We're not quite there yet, but there may well be a time in a not too distant future when the local authority cannot physically afford.
What would be the long-term implications of that then, if that goes the way of other cities here?
Well, there's a real initiative at the moment, of which Nick's, I know, is part of, called the Cultural Investment Inquiry. And it's about making up the culture pound, and the culture pound means the sort of amount of money that is required to sustain the existing provision, not to develop it necessarily, but even just to sustain it. And there's all sorts of, in fact, there's a big meeting on coming up on Thursday this week with stakeholders across the city to come and talk about what means there could be, and no stone is being left unturned. And obviously it's about philanthropy, it's about corporate sponsorship, it's about individual giving. And interestingly, with individual, I was at a sponsorship seminar the other day, individual giving accounts for 50% of an arts organisation's or a cultural organisation's sponsorship income. And that's a significant
average.
It's an average, of course it's an average, but across the board I don't think it's realised how important individual giving is in terms of the people that live and work in a city supporting that cultural sector.
And that would include, just to clarify, things like ticket sales, things like... Okay.
No, that's just about
so
giving.
Donations,
yeah, absolutely. But, so yeah, it's a real pressure. The Creative City agenda, of which there is, that's part of the LEP, which is the Local Enterprise Partnership, also has a role to play in spreading the word about the benefit of creative industries. But the creative industries, including the arts organisations, employ something like 55,000 people across the greater Birmingham. It's a big employer in that respect. And the turnover of arts organisations, the creative industry, something like 100 million. So that's not insignificant in terms of the economy, never mind just the value of the intrinsic value of arts.
I mean, what the rest of us think the implications will be of the commercial sector plugging that gap, or maybe not plugging that gap that's been left by...
I think it's answering to a couple of things you've said, Symon. So I think the debate on, of course, the council has big, challenges to face, and one of them is culture. But of course, there are others that are very, very important. But it always, when I hear someone say, "Well, we have also health," well, it shouldn't be a matter of this or this. It should be put together because, it's true that we need to take care of health for us, our elders and our younger generations. But, art is also a point that shows the health in mentality for the society. So if we leave that aside, then we will have a society that is that cannot face the challenges of the 21st century. And so
I couldn't agree more, Miguel. And I also think that arts has a huge role to play, well, in lots of reasons, but in terms of social cohesion and social...
absolutely.
Mental health is huge.
Mental health, but also in terms of the society.
Society.
It's a lot of health reasons for arts, as I'm sure we all know and understand, but also it's about social, building barriers, or building bridges, I beg your pardon, between communities, and particularly in Birmingham, whose population is something like 42% non-white, so it's going to be very important.
Well, this conversation about how stratified we are relative to other cities has come up frequently as well. And Alum Rock looks the way it does, Handsworth looks the way it does, and these silos very, rarely speak to each other. So culture has a massive role to play in bridging that gap. I worry again if there is only the commercial sector that's left to plug that gap, that the intention to do these sorts of, a noble and important things societally won't happen anymore. It's just the bottom line. If we're only commissioning things that our patrons consider art, if we're only commissioning things that affect the centre and not the periphery, then what will that mean for us as a city?
That's an interesting one in terms of ultimately take that argument to the end of the road. Whose sponsorship dollar would you take? And that's already challenging organisations. You mentioned the National Gallery and their relationship with BP, and I think I think arts organisations will need to do a lot of head scratching to make sure that the commercial organisations they work with have a value set which aligns with theirs. I think, though, to just trying to loop back to the position of where this funding gap might be bridged, I think that part of the culture inquiry, which is in train at the moment, is about looking at alternative financial instruments or vehicles for maybe realising city assets and using them in a different way. So I don't think just taking the hole in the funding hole in the ground and pouring purely commercial pounds in it is going to be the only answer. I think it's looking at how cities have assets in buildings and properties that could maybe be deployed in a different way to benefit our cultural spend, and that's in terms of, you'll be aware of the principles when in broad terms, if you build a new supermarket, there may be a levy on that construction which says, okay, you build that over there, but you've got to build a new sports centre over there, or you've got to put street lighting down that street, a kind of planning gain sort of principle. And it's some of those ideas that are starting to be teased out. Because Birmingham is still a developing city, let's not forget that in terms of the actual infrastructure. So there's something in that can be harnessed.
I mean, I think if I can pick up on a couple of points that you made, Symon, earlier on, I think, and I look at it from a small organisation again, so, you know, we've got a very small capacity. We get no core funding from anybody, but we do have project funding for certain activities. And we've worked with corporates. We find it quite hard to get to a point. The amount of networking that is required to get people on board is extremely time hungry. That doesn't mean that it's not when you do it. It's extremely rewarding, because you find that the opportunities that they have for a sort of privileged access and indulge their own passions is, you know, extremely rewarding for them. But obviously they bring sort of resources that we wouldn't otherwise have. But I think, how do we get to that point? And I would like to see an evolution in the way funding is done to an extent that would allow organisations to facilitate their own success by helping them get their IT infrastructure up to speed so that they're more efficient, you know, I don't know, get their marketing improved, or so that you can take the organisation a step up. I mean, I'm not saying from A to Z, but maybe A to B, and we might get to F and G on our own. Do you know what I mean? I think that would be a real step forward, really, rather than project-based funding. I suppose
I've never espoused the virtue that corporate responsibility or corporate sponsorship, is the answer, because it isn't, because we don't have the tradition like they do in the States, perhaps, of that sort of philanthropic giving. I should mention, before I forget to mention, that we do have corporate social responsibility. A lot of businesses do have a very genuine policy about giving back to the community, working with the community. It's not always addressed around arts. It's a lot of different things they have. But I think that's an important aspect of and we shouldn't expect businesses to fund,
plug the gap.
I
think the implication in this discussion is that there are always certain, perhaps, publicity or reciprocities that these companies are going to want. They might not fund, you know, art that we consider worthy, but they consider worthy.
Well, the mutual benefit thing is what's key, isn't it? And you mentioned about the gallery and BP. There are certain issues that don't suit both parties. But I want to pick up on something else Nick said, because I forgot to mention the cultural inquiry exactly is the no stone unturned, looking at all sorts of instruments that could look at how we're funded, and even talking about taxes of certain nature, business rates, and how that might contribute or not to the ability to make sure that the cultural infrastructure is still sustainable.
Satnam, have you been out to various arts institutions and had that sort of thing with maybe venues saying they're worried about the direction of cuts and
I've certainly reported on it, and I've reported on ways and means that organisations are discovering and exploring and actually carrying out as well in order to plug some of those funding gaps. And what comes to mind is, sort of the larger organisations within our city, funding or part funding, for example, first experiences of the Symphony Hall here with young children. So when it works very well. Is there enough churn? And is there enough being done perhaps in our districts with our grassroots organisations? I don't necessarily think so. Certainly it's not reflected in the reporting that I've done so far. I think some of the bigger players can afford to establish those relationships, but perhaps some of our smaller organisations are not quite there.
Yeah, I think she's absolutely right. Looking at sponsorship and private giving, all the sort of sources of income that we organizations are asked by several funders to look into, and fairly enough, they are extremely time consuming, and if you have the manpower to run those are successful. Symphony Hall is a great example. They do fantastic work through private giving, but for smaller organizations, it's just the amount of work you need to put into that is just not, it doesn't pay off, because it's a long-term strategy, this, and without the support from big institutions or the council to support that sort of work, it's just not sustainable. It's not sustainable. And on the other hand, there's, I think, a concept about what the art should be, and if we want art to be able to take risks, it cannot rely on individual giving.
You're preempting the next question. Actually, it's an important one. You know, this idea of what art should be and should it provide a challenge to sometimes comfortable interests. Here's the question: to what extent are artists and arts organisations responsible for and capable of shaping the wider world?
Well, you know, the artists need to ask questions. Really, that's their role. Is to, when there's an issue, they need to ask the question when someone has a certainty. That's their role, is to create uncertainty in people's mind. And there are some institutions, some organizations that might sponsor something that won't want questions to be raised. And so we will end up having a culture like in the States, which is mainstream culture, which is fantastic. I'm not complaining about that. That needs to exist and has a space for that.
But it's not oppositional. It's not. It's
yeah,
quite deferential.
But we need the other side.
I
also.
feel really strongly about this. Having an independent arts and cultural offering is an integral part of our society.
Yes.
Art is it's a medium which is so liberating. You can discuss some of the most politically charged issues of the day, some of the most religiously charged issues of the day, controversial issues, the lot. It can come to a fore through theatre, through artwork,
and our
through
lawmakers
singing.
love to espouse the virtues of arts in terms of the economy, in terms of what it says about Britain. They don't love to espouse what art challenges them about.
Absolutely. It's a platform to discuss, regardless of gender, ethnicity, background, everything that's going on around you, and whether that is on the part of an artist who's creating something in response to what's happening around them, or whether it's in relation to the audience coming to something and going away and questioning or forming their own opinions and ideas. It's an integral part of democracy. Without it, we would actually be fairly dense, I think, and there wouldn't be anything about us.
The answer to your question is yes, of course it does, and it always has done. I think arts and culture has always helped. It shapes us, who we are. It defines us. It gives us a sense of place, a sense of community, a sense of, but it also does all those things about challenging and questioning and entertaining. Let's not forget that. At the end of the day, it's such an important.
And bringing
medium
people together.
Just to throw a bit of a spanner in the works. I mean, we're all the choir here. We certainly all agree with that sermon. There are another generation of artists and other people I've spoken to who think, well, that's not my responsibility. I give the people what they want. I step to, provide a service towards demand. The notion of artists being a challenge to vested power or speaking truth to power and something, that might be something that we want to happen. But if we haven't encouraged it in practical terms, I don't know if artists will automatically get that memo. Some just want to be successful and just want to sell out their theatres.
Did William Shakespeare set out to do what he set out to do? Probably, but 400 years on, his words are just as relevant today as they were back then. Whether it's a now thing, or whether it's how you perceive it in the future. I just think it's
about changing and shaping the world was your question, wasn't it? And I think if you look at particularly the UK, we've done so much to do that, and not just in the subsidised art sector, the commercial music sector. Look at Adele, for example, just of recently in terms of Billboard and what she's managed to achieve. And I think our training and background of arts has been so critical in delivering some really, both commercial and sort of lyric companies success around the world. And England and Britain and UK is known for that. And I think it has helped, therefore, shape who we are and our identity across the world.
It's interesting what Soweto was saying about do people, is there actually a responsibility to do that? Saying if you have this platform, this visibility, should you do something with it or not? Or do you just want to entertain? But is that the end in itself? And that's kind of vexed cultural commentators for a long time. Ultimately, you can say you start with a blank page, you're going to write a song. You say you could write She Loves You, or you could write Free Nelson Mandela, couldn't you?
Yeah,
that's in some ways that's a conscious choice that you're making, and how do we as a kind of society value those
Precisely.
things?
And that's a much you can't just rely on artists to have those insights if they don't feel that it's going to be received in a particular way, if there's not an audience for them to appreciate that with.
But I think
there was a reason why so many more protest songs were written in the 70s and the 60s.
But both are political, you know. To say I love you, to say I love you is a big political statement. You know, it's a positive statement about caring for people. You know, and you know that can be very direct into I don't want racism to happen, and that's very direct. But I can also say I love you, and it's the same message, just told in different ways. You know, and those two things can happen at the same time simultaneously, and the art should, you know, reflect
and that's where
that.
we're healthy, because we have the diversity of arts and art forms, whether it's with intent or interpretation. You have that in our arts landscape at the moment, and that's what's so beautiful about our city and what we have to offer, as well as the wider region and the UK.
I think I'm agreeing with you and extending the point even more to say what's supposedly non-political can sometimes be the most political.
Absolutely, yeah.
Especially within the sphere of hip hop and stuff that I do now. If you talk about politics, then you're one of those left field conscious rappers. If you talk about money and big cars, which is essentially a neocon, you know, far right political lectern that you're getting up on. That's your soapbox. And the idea that certain things can be apolitical or not is quite dangerous, I think, in the current climate.
Do you think, may I ask a question actually, and I'm not directing this to anybody, but it's the point that Simon made earlier on about perhaps us not having a culture of giving from the commercial world in this country. And do you think that it isn't worth pursuing it, though, to a point? I appreciate all of the things that everybody just talked about there of the implications of that in terms of how that might sort of put a slant on what artists do. But I still think that there's more that could be done as well.
I think it's absolutely worth pursuing on the artist's terms. That's my thing. So if you're going to these companies, you don't have to be compromised, or if you are going to be compromised, then you should be prepared to walk away from the money. I think that's the.
But also, I completely agree, and you know, I have many colleagues who we all try to push ourselves to get that forward, but I think to think that we should rely on that would be a mistake. We shouldn't think that in 20 years' time or in 30 years' time that should be the core funding, because that would be putting in individual people the responsibility to fund the arts, which is, you know,
I quite agree with that. But I think if you also look at, I don't know how many businesses get involved in fundraising for various things. Somehow or other the arts doesn't quite fit into that yet, or doesn't often fit into it. And I think that in some way it could. And although I, you know, take all of the points that have been raised, I still think it shouldn't be dismissed.
I think the facile answer to this is it's a collective responsibility. So it's the individuals living in communities, it's businesses that have got their, you know, major businesses located in that locality. It is still the public sector to support communities and artists to deliver the work they want to do. And the Arts Council, we shouldn't forget, of course, the national organisation. But I think there needs to be a much more collaborative, collective partnership where the arts infrastructure or the cultural infrastructure is sustained.
I agree with that.
Well, Miguel, you've got a uncanny ability to preempt my next question. In 20 or 30 years' time, you were saying...
Sorry.
Well, yeah, have you read these? What is your vision of Birmingham and its arts and culture offering in 20 years' time? Interestingly, I think you're saying that we need this mixed economy and certainly a partnership of things. Would you see that you can have a dystopian or a utopian view of the future, but where do you see that in 20 years' time?
I think from a visual arts perspective, I think Birmingham is underrepresented with good art selling venues, so galleries, selling galleries. I don't think there are as many as in other major cities.
Here, and the ones that there are, I wouldn't say they're necessarily of the same standard.
Well, you know, I think that it's certainly notable to me that most of the artist peers that I have are on the train a lot to London, you know, and I think that that's a great shame, because we've got all of this, you know, culture of creativity in Birmingham, but not necessarily the culture of buying it. And I'm talking about visual arts here, and I know that you're all representing different mediums here, so, you know, but that's a very selfish perspective. So I'd like to see more of that in the future.
High-speed rail make any difference? Already I'm seeing
15
people...
minutes difference, I
15
think.
minutes difference. But I'm already seeing people I've been house hunting 6-7 months, and I've seen a few canny-looking property vultures looking to snap up deals with student properties or second properties in Birmingham that they can do that commute from. Do you think that will have an impact in 20 years' time?
I think
No.
Birmingham has the opportunity to become one of the greatest cities in the UK, really, because it's got all the assets for it to happen. It's got rent that is very cheap, so many artists who are based in London or in other cities might prefer to move to Birmingham. It's actually starting to happen already. There's a great collaboration between arts organizations in this city, I find. Especially compared to other cities in the UK. It's incredible how organizations support each other, and big organizations support small organizations. That's quite unique for this city, and it's, you know, a big asset. And it's a thriving scene. It's growing and growing, at least in the past 10 years. So I think in the next 20 years, we could see Birmingham really flourishing.
House prices is an interesting thing you've added into that there as well. The last big award ceremony I was at was the Paul Hamlin Foundation Award in London. They give awards of 50,000 to the youngest, brightest visual artists and musicians and stuff. Every single visual artist who had that award this year said they were going to spend it on studio costs, rent costs in London. Nobody said, I'm going to Madagascar to look at the special quality of light there, or to study in South America with my, you know, my guru or anything. Everyone was in Shoreditch and on whatever, paying for rent. And that's got a huge implication for the quality of visual arts produced in London. And a lot of them, as you imply, are looking at Birmingham with a view to that. Do you think that gentrification will happen in Birmingham to the same extent?
I sincerely hope not, because I think if there's one thing about Birmingham, we can really create our own identity from the the change that we are going through at the moment and the development that's happening. And it's almost like we have half a blank sheet to start with, and we can really shape it. We're at a point in time where we can really make it happen for us. I'd like to think in 20 or 30 years' time that, for me personally, one of my bugbears, as somebody's brought up in a British Asian family where my parents didn't go to the theatre, but I forced them to take me to the theatre. I forced them to take me to drama classes. I fought to become a journalist. You know, all those creative things which are not academically inclined and all that sort of stuff. They weren't totally against it, but it was just alien to them. I'd like to think in 30 years' time I will sit comfortably, and regardless of your background, ethnicity, gender, arts is as accessible, but is being accessed as it is today, with a greater offering. And that offering, I really hope, is a rich mix of some of our well-established organisations, but more importantly, in some ways, the peripheral stuff that we have happening in the city, which quietly goes on in the reps, the Digbuths, but in our suburbs.
Yeah,
it's about the suburbs. It's about taking it out into our suburbs.
This is one of our biggest challenges.
Sorry to interject, but also I feel so strongly about this with the work I'm doing with the flyover and things that happen in Handsworth. There's a huge specific cultural tradition there that's not necessarily recognised.
And it's just as important.
And we should be saying in 20 years' time, 20 years' time, there's 40 years of this, there's 60 years of this tradition that young British Asians have, Birmingham Asians, young British black people have growing up in Birmingham, young working class white boys have in Birmingham, that says that's their tradition, they can own it. And
I think that's starting to happen. That happens. Society takes time to evolve and to change. And you know, my parents' generation, for example, probably didn't have the same money, time to invest in arts and culture in the same way as we did, but they did practice arts and culture behind closed doors, singing sessions, jamming sessions together on Asian instruments.
Absolutely.
Now that's now transferred into community halls and hubs in our districts around the city. So looking forward, it's about connecting those with perhaps some of our established organisations, but celebrating it perhaps even out in the districts. Why do we have to come into the city centre all the time? Why can't we go out of the city centre to them.
Why don't
Yeah.
exactly?
And, you know,
Why don't people
and
from
it's just
Moseley and
about
Kings
being-
Heath go
absolutely.
to Ellen Rock?
And
And you know, why couldn't they?
And in my reporting, I so often notice that when I'm working with young people in schools, you know, you do go to the ACOT Greens and so forth, and there will be young people who don't particularly come into the city centre. It costs money to come into the city centre. It costs money to engage with our big cultural organisations. Looking forward, I'd love to see a vision where we break down those barriers, but not necessarily about dragging people in, but us going out to them.
I think that's a key part of the transition. You know, and I say this cautiously as someone who manages, you know, 2 big buildings. You know, I run building-based organisations, but I think as it stands, the cultural infrastructure or momentum is still around bringing people into these fixed points, and anything else that you do that which is, you know, historically characterised as outreach or education, work in the community, is seen as a kind of shortcut to them coming to do this other thing in your building. Whereas actually that other thing that you're doing is the thing in itself. You know, and that's a real kind of paradigm shift. And you know, it may not be that you know, people who operate buildings are necessarily people who physically deliver that, but they certainly enable that to happen. And you know, as Miguel was saying, that relationship between large and small organisations working in partnership, those that can be more agile and you know, become more embedded in those communities which aren't being served by people coming into this central thing, is part of getting to that point.
Do you remember what you were going to say earlier?
I think so, and it's connected with both following on. But it's both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is to try and reach communities that are not yet reached, and to get out, and not just in diverse communities, but in outlying suburbs, you know, Birmingham,
absolutely,
and how make sure that they are engaged and sharing that culture. But but by the same token, an opportunity that, you know, in 20 years' time, Birmingham will probably be 50% at least non-whites as well. So you know, the bringing of cultures together and using arts as the vehicle for doing that is a great opportunity. Just going back to your original question about, I think there's, to be pedantic a minute, a difference between a vision and aspiration, if I may say that. The vision is sort of based on what's the situation like now, what will the economy be like in 20 years, what the transport infrastructure links, a whole host of other, you mentioned housing, host of other things that create and shape what that vision might be. The aspiration is not necessarily, you know, connected. Well, it should be connected with that, but it is slightly different. That if we do want truly all people in Birmingham to feel that they do have access and can get access to arts and culture, that's what we should be really working, in spite of the other challenges about the economy and the housing and the transport and the infrastructure. But it's very difficult. The last 5 years has seen so much change in terms of the funding situation and all sorts of, you know, societal changes, etc. We've now got the West Midlands Combined Authority coming up next, and we're going to get an elected mayor for the region. Not that necessarily will affect, I don't think, culture greatly, but it's another factor, another layer of infrastructure and governance that we're going to have to work our way through.
But why wouldn't that affect culture? Because actually having an elected mayor, should it then that is absolutely. That's an opportunity for somebody to be shouting about the rich offering that we do have.
Don't get me wrong. I hope it does, but in reality, there are much bigger issues about infrastructure of transport, housing, jobs, and economy. And you know, I'm not a fool. I do understand that jobs and economy will have a vital role to play in the success of any city or region, because really fundamentally that's the foundations of a societal success. People have got jobs, they've got money, they then have the time and the opportunity to access other things.
I think, you know, Miguel, it goes back to Miguel's point he made earlier, that this idea of a trade-off between health and art, you have to, at some level, be spending on all of them. And of course there are priorities of cancer treatment and going to the ballet, you know, it's not necessarily that, but if you don't have any kind of vision for the arts and spending amongst that whole mixed economy, then there'll be dire consequences for all the other things.
And also culture is pennies, you know, compared to the other matters we're talking about. Is really pennies. So that doesn't really
return on investment,
doesn't make a difference. It does when you cut it.
But to attract the right type of people as well into the city, you need to have the right type of cultural offering.
Exactly. I mean, that's a key driver for inward investment, isn't it? Like, you're not going to get a major bank moving over the road if you've got a rubbish cultural offer, you know, and we need to keep shouting that.
But it can be good business as well for areas like you've described, Satnam, where if the business people in that area recognise that bringing a huge number of people in for a cultural activity to their area happens once a year and it becomes something that they do on an annual basis, well, I mean, that's got to work. I don't think that necessarily therefore requires centralised organisation. It means something locally happening as well, you know. So that there's got to be a balance there, I think, because otherwise I think the council, sorry to look at you this, but I think the council is just trying to achieve all of what we've talked about there, you know, in amongst everything else.
There are models out there. The Digbeth Dining Club comes to mind. I mean, what a small movement that started out in the Arches in Digbeth, and you know, just last weekend they've been in King's Heath. So there are these little pop-ups that are coming up
just to elaborate on that further, one thing we've not mentioned, which is what your background is, festivals as well. Yes. With the other, you mentioned in the past. There's a wealth of brilliant festivals, and Miguel is being a good example of a relatively new festival. But not just that, but there's the religious and community festivals that take place across the city that are really successful, and we shouldn't forget that ability to draw in people at a local level, and something that they associate with very closely. It's about, we were saying earlier, weren't we, about ownership. If you can get the local population's ownership in that activity, in that cultural engagement, we're halfway there.
This point we kind of brushed on earlier makes me think about an answer to this question that I've got on my card. So I'll do my own response. I'll ask my own question, answer it, and then open up to you guys. In these coming years, how will your organisations remain relevant, and how best can you position yourself to deliver to the needs of our increasingly diverse communities and of Birmingham as a global city? Now, the word that I hone in on is diverse communities, and I'm thinking about, again, the point about silos and living in different pockets, and then a conversation I had yesterday about, what's his name, Grayson Perry's show, An All Man, and his experience in, you know, the Liverpool area, with young white men who are essentially appropriating a very African-American culture, Tupac and knives and manhood. We're talking about displaced manhood. We're talking about a generation of people who don't feel they have a platform, irrespective of their skin colour, and they're using culture that they feel emasculates them and gives them the tools to do that. I think arts provision more generally should be filling that gap, the emasculation things that are happening around the city, just exclusion things that are happening, and not even considering it culturally specific or ethnically specific, but looking at what are the core reasons why people feel they're not part of the body politic, they're not part of Birmingham culturally.
Can I just throw in something that I think about often, and that the concern is that as the public sector investment in funding arts and culture goes down, we see more social unrest, we see more social issues that then will need addressing, and my concern is that in a few years' time government will be throwing back money to the arts because they recognise that we're a great vehicle for dealing with some of these very difficult social issues. So I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, it might not be called funding the arts, but it'll be some vehicle and mechanism. Some mechanism. Well, it will, and you know, will it be sustainable again, or will it just be sort of, you know, parachuting in funding to sort out an immediate problem? I mean, that is my concern, actually. But no, you're right. I think it's beholden, going back to this point about collaboration, it's beholden on all of society, corporate business, individuals living in communities, public sector organisations, you name it, to come together and try and work through these challenges.
I just feel if we don't get past this notion of we need to help them, the disaffected, disadvantaged, unwashed people, then we're really going to perpetuate inequalities that...
Yeah, because it's a form of kind of patriarchal...
Absolutely.
Sort of
cultural imperialism.
It is, and it's how you kind of rejig. I hate to use the word institutions, but that's kind of what they are at the moment. Or the funding infrastructure, call it what you like, to be more responsive and more fluid to allow the development of the kind of thing that you're talking about. I mean, you absolutely couldn't, you know, an organisation like Symphony Hall, it would feel like that cultural appropriation. You know, if we went into certain areas and said, now, young man, we're going to deliver a lovely grime workshop for you, and you're going to be the next...
how to be a man.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to be the next... What's his name? Storm Boy?
Rascal Boy.
And so how do you... But at the moment, the kind of... the power is the wrong word, but the influence is concentrated in relatively small number of organisations. And how do you successfully engage and nurture those organisations that can't, you know, bowl up to Deutsche Bank and say, do you want to sponsor this, you know, thing? What's the output? Well, you'll see a guy produce some tracks in his bedroom. You know, bring your corporates in, we'll have salmon, you know, we'll have salmon canapes before.
Yeah, that's a hard sell.
Yeah, exactly. So how do you kind of get something that responds to that kind of need? Because, you know, that's what a true breadth of culture is about, isn't it? It's not about, you know, the big ticket organisations.
And just to go back on what you were saying, surely what, you know, about the, I couldn't remember the expression you used, but about a certain group of young men, but aren't they expressing their cultural identity? Hasn't that happened through the ages, you know, with mods and rockers?
Absolutely.
And, you know, I'm old enough to grow up through the punk, you know, through the punk generation. We now look back on the punk generation as being a sort of fondly as a sort of,
it's been repackaged as punk 40, you know.
Exactly.
It was dangerous. It was edgy.
Isn't that just a natural sort of progression for that as younger generations come through, they want to express themselves in a perhaps seemingly challenging way?
I think what I'm looking at is the hypocrisy of 30, 40 years afterwards, corporations coming on and selling jeans with rips in them. And, you know, the insincerity of saying, oh, this is Britain, hip hop and grime, we love it now. But at the time, we did everything we could to sort of make it feel unwelcome in the building. And that is it. It is a change.
But doesn't it take time to I mean, look at the street art, for example, now called street art. It was called graffiti, you know, when it first came out, wasn't it? Street art is, I know we still get graffiti, of course, but street art is celebrated as an art form. I don't know, Richard, but do you think that's a valid?
Systemic reasons why, you know, because it took Banksy to come along and say, oh, it's all right, or it took somebody out of Johnsy.
Muhammad Ali, a local artist who's done some fantastic work. He's another good example. Banksy's the obvious sort of thing you drag out, but sorry, you were going to say.
No, I was going to say that, we can compare to mods and Sky and all that, but, you know, society has changed. We live in a society that is really liquid with internet, bombarding young people with information and with all sorts of things that I think it's overwhelming, and young people need a space for finding their own identity, and that needs to be given also through the arts. And we have a responsibility, arts organizations, to provide a space for young people to explore who they are and who they want to be, and that that takes a lot of care and a lot of time, but I think needs to be tackled, really.
I think it needs a pretty brave and bold approach, and also not ignoring the fact that actually a lot of our young people are living in the world of social media.
Absolutely.
So it's not necessarily the traditional coming to a venue and consuming arts and culture that way. So perhaps it's about us thinking innovatively about how we either deliver the arts to them in their bedroom or on their mobile phones and so forth, or perhaps create it for that medium. I mean, what's to say that, for example, citywide, that we can't create a programme where young people are producing their own pieces of art, whatever genre it may be, and then publishing it somehow on a social media platform, which then gets projected out on a building in the city centre.
I don't think these approaches are mutually exclusive. I still think there is an important space. As a jazz musician, has gone into communities and schools where they've never seen a saxophone and played it. It might seem a quite paternalistic, culturally superior way of doing it, but they need to see instruments and hear forms of music that they haven't had an encounter with before. The flip side to that is, what are you about? What are your stories? Your ideas will be taken seriously in this context.
But then it's about creating the space for them to do that, isn't it? Whether that space be
both.
Online or offline,
if it's just a matter of meeting them where they're at, that's not going to change some quite.
It's about changing the mindset of that one young person in the school that you have visited.
And I don't think that would have happened on an iPad. I'm being perhaps
no,
old school.
It wouldn't have. You're right. It has to be both online and offline. So it has to be in person, and it's reflecting the different mediums that we use. But there's nothing more powerful than a one-on-one. And again, I'm a great believer in this.
School, you got your hand up, Rich. I'm sorry to interrupt. When you were talking earlier on, I know you've had an education debate already, but I think a critical factor in all of this is the future provision of arts in schools, or the lack of it. I think it's a real concern. And the whole movement to academy status and schools having control of their own budgets, not making the decision to invest in arts as part of the curriculum, and the BBAC and all the rest of it that's been talked about, not including arts, is a tragedy. And that's, for me, that's my interest was gleaned at school through the endeavours of teachers and people that had the passion in it. And that's I go right back to time.
Absolutely.
And it's a real concern for me that at school there isn't going to be that investment or that attention.
Although as
I
a society
totally
and as
agree.
arts creators, and we need to almost assume some sort of responsibility and get ourselves into those schools to even if it's just talking about what you do, that can change. That can just open up a little bit of the door, a little creak in the door for a young person to go home and say, Mum, I really want to go into that concert, or take me to the theatre.
Yeah.
It's very small. But
I'm not sure I'm the best person to comment on this, but it does strike me that whenever councils or parents get involved in telling their children what they should like and what they shouldn't like, and so
a bad idea.
this is when it all goes wrong. And when you're talking about, when you're talking about the punk movement or whatever, and it's now become iconic, and clearly Vivienne Westwood's clothing and all of that kind of stuff has sort of come out of that, but at the time it wasn't, and probably it was interesting to those young people because it was, edgy, and it was on the fringes of society and so on. And I think that somehow or other we need to not get too micromanagey about that kind of stuff, because I just think you can't predict what's
no one's going to tell them
can
this is how art should look or sound. But I think we still can encourage those encounters, those interventions.
Satnam's talking.
Exactly,
I agree with
that they wouldn't have.
It's simply about talking and presenting, and that's what it comes down to. The basic thing of communicating with each other.
But if it's become commodified enough for us to be talking about it here, it's probably not happening in those fringes that we're talking about nurturing, if you understand what I mean. It's almost that you need to find the space, something that we're talking about things which are already kind of emerged into identifiable genres or art forms. It's about how you have those conversations where where was grime before it was recognised as being grime, and how do you make that? How do you support that conversation? Because it's almost self-defeating. We're talking about something which has become tangible, but it starts from something which is intangible, and it's how do you support that?
But by having the spaces for young people to go into, to be able to express themselves,
to find that path.
Yeah, they're going to create in their bedrooms, on the street corner, in their mate's house. Where are they going to platform it? That's a much bigger question. We've only got a few minutes left, so what meaningful actions will you take this year to improve the arts in Birmingham, and what would you advise other artists and organisations to do?
Well, that's all pretty straightforward. Who's going to start with that one?
Yeah. I'm going to do it all. I'm going to fix art
exactly.
in general.
Well, can I come in from the local front, which may help? I think we've already done a lot this year, to be honest with you. I mean, we've got the Year of Youth Arts as nominated for this year. So we're hoping, create a programme around that. We've put some investment into that. Next year, we're looking at the Year of South Asian Culture as a sort of nominated year. The cultural strategy, the refreshed cultural strategy, which has been developed in partnership with a lot of cultural organisations. We spent a lot of time working with different individuals and artists organisations. That'll be launched in June. The cultural inquiry that Nick mentioned earlier as well is happening. So I would hope already from a local authority point of view, we're sort of right in there with trying to get these programmes, projects off the ground. As far as local arts delivery is concerned, we established local arts for some 10 in 2010, 2011. We're still hoping to support that infrastructure on the ground in terms of the outer districts for the council, and still encouraging our major funded arts organisations to continue with their Arts Champions scheme, which is about working in the local community and creating relationship between local residents and that particular arts organisation. So that's
what you'd advise artists and organisations, just the last part of the question, to come and see you or go to a website, or what would you advise, aspirant artists to
get involved in the local arts fora. It would no matter where they're located, and if it's in the city centre or it's out in one of the outlying districts as such. Certainly, get engaged and continue that dialogue and work in partnership with not just us, but with other arts organisations. I think Miguel was absolutely right earlier on that in the last 6 years I've been here, some of the major arts organisations, the Rep being a very good example, have really helped facilitate some of the sort of smaller scale arts organisations to develop and to grow. And it is that sort of local arts infrastructure and trying to support local artists to be visible and to work in partners. It's a really important. It's a real challenge, but it's going to be so important.
So last year, this is our little contribution to the city, we pitched that to European embassies and cultural attachés that Birmingham should be the city to bring European work, and that embassies and governments from Europe should support art not only going to London but beyond. And so this year we've got 20 delegates from 20 countries around Europe coming to see the city and meet the council, arts council, several arts organizations during our festival to hopefully...
Just throughout the year or one big...
They're coming for 2 days during our festival in 4 weeks' time.
Great.
And hopefully they'll start conversations with arts organization and we'll have more international work coming in the future years, thanks to that, hopefully.
Brilliant.
We're running a print festival at the RBSA this summer, which will be sort of a...
So the unvisual artist, the print festival is not just like particular kinds of art?
Yeah, so it's essentially all types of print. So it's works on paper that are created by sort of, lithographs, making contact with paper with things other than pencil, paper, paint and so on. So we've got lots of family-friendly workshops and other activities being supported by Arts Council, adult education and demonstrations throughout the summer. So that should one to watch out for.
We're about, I think, we're looking in macro terms. Symphony Hall was 25 years old this year. We are facing the funding challenges we've all been talked about. My immediate role is about making a sustainable organisation for the next 25 years. That's not a particularly sexy thing to put out there, but in terms of what that means in terms of delivery, we're still delivering all the good stuff that we have done. So those legs are running very fast below the surface. But we are looking at this year we'll be pitching to the Arts Council to sustain our Jazz Lines programme, which does huge amount of work, way beyond the funding that it gets in terms of the visibility and taking kids in the beginning of a process, showing them what a saxophone is, and getting them graduating to being professional musicians at the end of it. We've had that kind of depth of engagement, continuing to work on our. Sure, you have Brian Wilson here last week producing Pet Sounds, performing Pet Sounds, absolutely iconic performance. But a couple of days afterwards, you have Community Spirit, which is bringing 18 or 19 choirs from across the West Midlands regions to perform on the. And it was absolutely fantastic. All the stuff that we're talking about, if you want to, stop kind of thinking about it in the abstract and see what that actually looks like on stage. People having a wonderful community engaged collective experience about the simplicity of singing together, and it's delivering those kind of really simple touch points, which is going to be a continuing part of what we do.
Thanks. Satnam.
Well, obviously I can't speak for BBC Birmingham because I'm not in a position to speak for BBC Birmingham, but I'd like to see BBC Birmingham being at the heart of the cultural offering here in the city in years to come. On a very personal level, I've made more of a commitment this year to go into schools and just speak to young people, because I think that one-on-one contact is just absolutely invaluable. It's the sort of stuff that, a few words of encouragement here and there helped me along the way, and I think if you can do that for the next generation, then yeah. If I had all the money in the world, I would happily pay for first-time theatre goers to go to the theatre. I really, really would. So if I win the national lottery, that's what I'll do.
Free theatre for all.
Well, it just
think. To that.
Yeah.
No, I just think that there's lots of people of a certain generation, certainly in my community. I'm from Wolverhampton originally. There's so many ladies groups, and they won't have been to see a musical or so forth. And there's so much out there on offer, and it's getting better amongst my generation. But there's a whole load of people that have not tapped into the wonderful offerings that we have.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One final point I'd like to make, if I can, is that I think what I hear from Nick, and I think we should have mentioned a lot more, is actually in a few years' time, we need to make sure that all of our cultural organisations are still here, so that we're able to do the things we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Because if we let them go by the wayside,
that's the ecology, isn't it? I agree with you there. You know, you need to have the local community arts organisations. You need to have centres of excellence in those communities. You need to have central places that funnel this talent and celebrate it when they
absolutely.
But most of all, we all need to talk about it and shout about it. We just don't do that enough. I mean, of course, we try and do it through broadcasting and so forth, but it's down to each individual citizen to stand up proud and say, it's a brilliant city to be in. It's fantastic. Looking forward, what we've got to offer, and it can only get better.
Yeah, and
come here.
Following the title of this discussion, really about vision, I think an advice to young artists, I can speak from personal experience. If you can be as clear of this nebulous vision, I'm sure probably the same for you, Miguel. You weren't completely clear of what the festival would look like, but you were very passionate about it in your mind and actualising these visions. It's a real thing. So. Especially as artists, we get to see that process quite often, and that's something we should impart to the rest of the city. Taking an incorporeal idea and making it real is something very magical that we get an insight into. There is one more question.
Oh, is there?
The not smooth segue. Outside of your own individual organisation, what one strategy or idea would you implement right now to improve Birmingham's arts offering? Think big! !
This is for Symon. I've got this one prepared. I think the City Council, despite of the cuts, and I think there's so much the City Council can do, and you have so many buildings that are there waiting for them to be occupied by arts organisations.
I wish I could high-five you from here, but... Yeah.
And, you know, that they should be given to the arts organisation to just transform them and make them buildings for be taken by the people. And I know you have constraints because you need to sell those buildings, and I understand that, but you should, not you personally, but the City Council should, you know, take some and say, this one we're not going to touch, we're going to give it to the arts, and they're going to run it. That's my thought.
I, you know, not for me to respond to that, because obviously my property services colleagues will probably have a completely different view, and I get myself into trouble. But what I would say, and I'm going to cheat a bit on your question, is what, you know, thing outside of our organisation. Two things spring to mind which are already happening. One is the formation of Culture Central as a new vehicle and as a new identity, because it's beyond whatever the local authorities, you know, trying to project. It has a life of its own, which I think will be very important for the future profile and identity of Birmingham and how it's supporting itself. The other is, which we will be involved in more closely, is the establishment of Partnership for Culture, which will lead on the cultural strategy that I mentioned earlier on. And this is about bringing other, not just Culture Central as being major players in that, but other areas, health sector and, you know, community deliverers to help deliver this going back to this collaboration thing I was talking about earlier, that there's a collective responsibility across all sectors to help promote culture and the arts and invest in its future.
I mean, one thing that it might not sound as ambitious as thinking big, but I think it is really big, but it's in a quiet way. If we lose the teaching of arts within schools, which seems as though it is happening, as much as everybody seems to be saying that it shouldn't, but if it does, how do we retain those skills and to continue to sort of perpetuate them? And I think that is something that organisations like the RBSA can do that within the visual arts to a point, but we're a very small organisation. I'm very worried about, you know, what happens when kids come out of school and they don't play musical instruments, they haven't had the opportunity to learn how to draw, whatever it is that floats your boat. That's a really significant worry, and I think that having these cultural organisations that can retain those skills to more enlightened times might not be such a bad thing.
You got one?
I'd set up a citywide lottery. A citywide lottery, which would mean that people can put the money in, and every week there'd be a certain amount of tickets offered up as the return, and with the hope that if there was some postcode involved in that, you would be able to reach out to some of our communities and districts where art participation isn't quite as healthy as perhaps it could be.
Great idea.
I was actually going to team up with you, Satnam, on your personal buying. When you won the lottery, I was going to come in dibs with you and
Use the money.
Yeah, to fund this first arts attendance. Yeah. No, I mean there's a serious point in there, isn't there? That you know, if those traditional gateways into enjoying culture aren't visible or highlighted in the educational system, how on earth do you get that kid out of their room and to experience something which is real, not virtual, and and is about community? How do they even see different people? How do they sort of react with a wider community in a experience of sharing something if they haven't got that appetite kick-started?
Yeah.
I think I'll cheat by taking all of your big ideas and having disused spaces and buildings all over the city in which actually they serve as conduits.
Full of lottery tickets.
Full of lottery tickets.
You could have a takeover day though, couldn't you? That could be another big idea. Just one day
one
where
all
you
this
open up
derelict,
buildings and you sort of takeover day, and you could build maybe even a national momentum around it.
So
I might even take it to a commissioning team. There's a story.
It'd be brilliant. It'd be brilliant. But really also about not audience development but audience cross-pollination. That this group who've never thought about going there, there'd be some incentive for them to go and see it in Nichel's, and then the Nichel's audience to go to Selly Oak, who they'd never go, so that kind of mixing up of the pockets of people.
And it does work. We did it recently actually for a piece that I did. We took a bedroom artist here, in fact, to the Symphony Hall. First time experience of sitting in a rehearsal. It worked so well. Very simple. I mean, that was obviously for a TV piece, but that concept, that framework could work.
It should.
Many ways.
Paradigm shifting.
Yeah, and I think cultural central things like that will help happen. That's great.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
In fact, I would definitely say all of them, in a sense, have to happen. If you can't have this organisation without letting anybody know about it as well, and making some fuss across the city about what's happening. So, thanks. This has been a really lively and interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've actually
Back
got
to
to
work.
go downstairs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Afraid
Bit
so.
of a busy day at the council today.
Never a dull moment. Why? What's happening again? Oh, it's
the trust thing,
yes.
voluntary trust
Yeah.
being set up.
Yeah. Yeah, lots going on. We're a bit clear
What's
about
going on
where
this
we are
evening
now
at,
with who's who, and we're now
Symphony Hall?
We have
Right.
Councillor Holbrook
is it Wednesday yet?
No,
it's Tuesday today.
So we're now
tomorrow, so that must be
forward councillor.
Yeah.
That's important because you need that political stability.
I was here last night.